Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is coming up on the first anniversary of tumultuous and immoral invasion of a country by Vladimir Putin. And that the implications of that have spread and rippled around the world. You know, it's not just through energy prices, food prices. Uh, Millions of Ukrainians moved into Poland. It's teaching students there is a terrible challenge. It's a human-heated planet, as I've been writing for 35 years. It's still a pandemic-wrapped planet. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way, but recently, a contact of mine at the World Bank threw together the latest data. There are still several, about I think it's just under just under 3 billion people with a B still haven't received one shot, let alone boosters. And now we have the possibility of a avian flu percolating. So there's a lot going on, and it's all going on at once. And through all of this process, students and teachers and administrators at schools have been struggling with not just how to carry out conventional education, but how to educate for this moment, how to educate and activate students in ways that get through the paralysis, get through the confusion, grapple with and normalize the opportunities that arise in situations like this as well. And that's what we're going to talk about today. This is a Columbia Climate School Sustain What webcast, one of many in a track I've done over the last 3 years, focused a little bit on education. I'm Andy Revkin. I'm coming to you from rural Maine, Wabanaki territory, and one of my guests is also from not too far away, Zoe Weil from the Institute for Humane Education. Down on the left here, you can see her below. She just got back from Denver, and it's been great to get to know Zoe and the Institute for Humane Education. You'll learn more about that. Radhika Iyengar, a colleague at Columbia, who's the education director for the Center for Sustainable Development, involved in many great initiatives here and around the world. I loved getting to know her work on fluoridation, the risk of excess levels of fluoride in water in South Asia, so much more you'll learn about from Radhika. Silas Swanson, who's been on an unbelievable trajectory from his high school days, probably before high school, I don't know, where, if I have this straight, your town in the Adirondacks, you helped the town do their climate plan when you were in high school. They didn't have anyone else who knew much about it. And here you are now at the Electric Power Research Institute in Palo Alto, California, after a great education at Columbia. And in your education at Columbia, you also were pioneering student climate summits to get high school students in the region activated around climate. So it's just great to see you, Silas. And thanks for coming on early from there. And finally, our real the spark that initiated this particular chat is Peter Sutoris's new book, Educating for the Anthropocene, which is available for purchase, but also there's a free online download edition. So I love that, because there's one thing we need. It's open access resources so that teachers and students and the rest of us struggling to make progress are not impeded by financial constraints. Peter's at the University of York, a lecturer, background in anthropology. The book is this remarkable journey. It's ethnographic and autoethnographic work that, you know, as you were looking at how people are confronting violence, the sort of violence of profound social inequity in a couple of places in India and in South Africa. You were also examining how education can function in this arena. Thanks so much to all of you for being here today, and Peter, especially again for stimulating this. So I thought we'd start with Peter, and the question I would ask you initially is, how did you become who you are so far? Now that could lead to a very long answer, of course, but you know, what was the spark that pulled together this sort of new framing, a new hypothesis for what education should do at the interface between knowledge and action? I think that's a really important part of what you've gotten at. And it even included some really, your background is really interesting, photography and film. There's I might show the film clip with the sound off while you're introducing yourself. So, uh, how did you become who you are so far? And then we'll get to where do we go from here?
Sure. Well, thanks. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, that would be a very, very long answer, so I'll try to just, touch on a couple of strands. I used to be a bit of a filmmaker. I used to work in documentary film and bit of a photographer, but I also had a few-year sort of career in international development, and I guess in both of those things, I was trying to work out how can I do something meaningful in this moment that we are in, and I guess both of those things led me back to education, and that education is just this incredibly powerful force and a key sort of part of the puzzle to really address what's happening. I think, as you were mentioning in the beginning, this is a very, very complex moment. It's not just about climate change. It's not about any one particular issue. And I think that's also what the word Anthropocene sort of suggests, that this really is a multi-crisis. And education, I suppose, really helps us tackle the sort of cultural, political roots of that crisis. So that is really what I arrived at in my work, sort of around the world, both sort of documenting what is going on, trying to intervene in what is going on, and that's what ultimately led me to do this research and to sort of come back to academia and write this book.
Yeah, you said here, I'm showing you some images from the book from Pashalak, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, in India, and Wentworth in South Africa. And Pashalak is an area like places around the world where quote unquote clean energy can be very disruptive as well. And dams, hydro, here, well, not here, but north of New York City, where I used to live in the Hudson Valley, the reservoir system was built to supply water to that city. It displaced many people. Cemeteries were moved, communities, and it created generations of stress between Catskills residents and the city. And obviously, here you have even more monumental disruption. And you said this in the book, the more immersed my field sites it became, the more this clear-cut distinction between activism and schooling seemed like a caricature of the research I was doing. And that, can you talk a little bit about the norms that we think of for what a classroom is about, and then how this activism dynamic relates?
Mhm. Yeah, of course. I sort of had this hypothesis coming into this research that the spaces of activism and the spaces of education or spaces of schooling are entirely separate, and that these are, two groups of people who don't really talk to each other, who are quite suspicious of each other. And to some extent, the research did show that that was the case sometimes, but it also showed that these are very sort of fluid hybrid identities. So, for example, in the book, there is this section called the outlier teachers, which is looking at teachers who are in many ways activists as well, and who are functioning within the realm of state-sponsored, state-controlled education systems, but who are very much trying to push the boundaries of that and trying to do things that are quite different and quite creative. So I think I came out of this after sort of several years working on this, thinking that being an educational activist or an activist educator, that these are very real identities that people out there in the real world do possess. These are not oxymorons, and that there's something really important to be learned from that, to be learned from that interaction between schooling and activism, and that is perhaps a particularly interesting intersection to explore when we are rethinking what the classroom might look like at this moment, the Anthropocene moment. And I think there's really something to be said for not shying away from politicization. I think there's a big difference between politicization with sort of capital P, which has to do with trying to advance particular ideologies, versus politicization, sort of smaller case P, which is to do with just really helping young people realize that they are political beings, that they have a voice, that their voice matters. And that is, I think, where activism is a very, very interesting space, because of course this is what activists have been doing for decades. They've been trying to bring people in to amplify their voices. And so that's why I think, we would do well to pay attention to that.
And before we go further with the others too, I wanted to, filmmaking was part of what these kids were doing in both places, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I was sort of faced with this question of how do you actually explore the idea of educating for the Anthropocene? And maybe one thing I should also mention is, the reason I chose these two places was because I sort of thought of them as almost like a little time machine, that sort of gives us a preview of the kind of environmental degradation that perhaps we don't yet see everywhere in the world, but which we will soon see, I think. And I was really interested in, how people in these spaces make sense of that. How do they think of the future in the face of this kind of violence and environmental decay? And I really wanted to make sure that I get the voice of the young people, the children themselves, into the project. And that's where I thought I might have to get a little bit creative with the methods that I use. And simply just sort of sitting them down and doing an interview isn't going to cut it. You need something that is sort of allowing for that translation between generations. And so I sort of looked around and came across this technique of participatory filmmaking as a way of exploring the future, as a way of making sense of experience. And I thought that was quite interesting. So I ran these workshops in both places where these young people would learn how to use camera equipment, and then they would go out, keep the equipment for a couple of months, and sort of, on their own time, unsupervised film their experience, and then put together these short films. Which then both sort of became something for me and other people to look at and sort of try and make sense of. But it also became a conversation starter, and it allowed me to actually involve these young people in the analysis of those films. So they could actually do the interpretation rather than me kind of trying to second guess what they were trying to do. And I guess the sort of biggest lesson that came out of those films for me was that they were instinctively seeking out the activists in their communities. And this happened both in India and in South Africa without really any conscious, at least, intervention from me. They really sort of framed the activists as the sort of central focus of the films. And when we talked about why they did that, they made it very clear that they saw these activists as sort of really inspiring figures, as people that they wanted to learn from. And they almost used the film as an excuse to get closer to them. So I thought that was really interesting, that there was something quite deeply rooted in their sense making of the world that was connected to activism, and that was a kind of instinctual move that they made. So that also made me think of activism as a space of education. So you could say that that's not really my argument; it's the argument that came from these young people.
That's so interesting. There's so much more to dig in now. We'll circle back to some of the next questions, but that's a great start. Radhika, again, I've gotten to know you. You have a very multidimensional and wide geographically widespread landscape you're working on. What pulled you to this arena? And I love you had this piece that came out just in December. Education isn't considered a key tool for reducing climate risks, but it should be. I couldn't agree more that too much of what I see out there in the education arena around climate is like climate literacy. Kids need to know what a greenhouse gas is. And I just think that's so many steps from efficacy that it feels like a waste of time for many, but that's just me. So Radhika, tell us a little bit about how you became who you are so far. And was there some key moment that drove you into the education arena, first of all, and then just describe some of your work? That'd be great.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for doing this important session on climate education. I think we need to voice our concerns and bring everyone together in these discussions. And my actually entry into this is because I was I was living in Bhopal when the gas tragedy happened in 1984. And I just accidentally survived. Our family accidentally survived because the wind was blowing in some other direction and we got saved because of luck. And then my mother, with the missionaries of charity, with Mother Teresa at the same time, she came to down to Bhopal and helped a lot of the victims who were in these huts and putting eye drops and other things. And then a couple of days later, the school opened, and then we were all going back to school. Some of our friends passed away, families had were dispersed, they had gone, they fled outside the city, the schools opened, and we just continued our curriculum as if like nothing happened. Whereas in my city, the whole world was demonstrating, people from outside were there were a lot of activists. My mother was like had swollen feet, everyone was like trying to do what they can. And so I was in fifth grade, so I didn't know what was happening. There was a big disconnect. I was supposed to do my homework, which I did. And then later on in when I finished my PhD in economics of education, I worked. This thing was in the back of my mind, and there was a journal called the Comparative Education Review Journal, which is a fantastic journal in my field. And my professor Monisha Bajaj and I worked on this analysis where we looked at the Bhopal case study and saw that after 20 years, what has the education system learned from it, and found out that human-made disasters are not included at all and have not been given due importance in the curriculum. It was just fill in the blanks. Which gas came out? Fill in the blank. How many people died? Fill in the blank. That too is controversial because there's no official numbers. So I think there was a big gap on what do we learn as the education system, and schools and children. We have the responsibility to discuss what is going on locally. And I couldn't agree that there is this division, at least in this case, between activism and schooling. So again, that paper was we worked on this paper. It came out in 2011, and since then I've been working at the Earth Institute with all the scientists who are trying desperately to make their research known in communities. So I've been working, as you mentioned, fluoride, microplastic. The scientists here at the climate school are saying, let's work together. This is a movement. We need to carry on. We need to have anthropologists together. We need to have education together. We need to have so many architects, design leaders coming together to think about climate education holistically. Or climate solutions holistically, not just technocratic information and technical solutions. That's not going to cut it. So I think my evolution towards now, then 2015 the UN adopted the sustainable development goals, and I found them really empowering to bring everything together, because that is what we needed. We can't have education, we can't have health, we can't have environment separately working anymore. So that was again my motivation, working with Professor Jeffrey Sachs and our amazing team internationally, locally. But again, I saw a lot of divide where I would travel locally in many parts, in rural India, rural African countries, Malawi and others, and I saw many people burning plastic. So again, they were going to school, and I didn't understand, when they are going to school, why are they not being careful about the environment around them, and why are we not appreciating what we have and creating more pollution? So there was a clear divide between what we can do in education versus what we should be doing. So I started creating this group called the Eco Ambassadors, and they are these amazing students all over the world, in India, in New Jersey, locally where I stay, where they started bringing up these issues, and I started connecting them to the climate school scientists, and they started, microplastic scientists would come in and say, okay, so what do you think? So this person, our Eco Ambassador, one of them, started collecting water samples from all the counties in New Jersey and started testing the amount of microplastic in the content that's not in the water, and that was not taught in schools. So this whole activism, this whole idea of how can we bring education and activism together, just happened automatically through these students. And then they led the course, and they said, okay, now we want to, as Peter was just saying, films and these stories and the images were so important that they started introducing these images and stories in these things called story maps, which we work with Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDGs, today, to hear their stories. Because it was, we had enough of top down information from teachers or whoever, We wanted to hear from them, what do you want to learn? And they were amazing to tell us what they want to learn and how they are learning it, in schools, outside schools. So there was this bridge between outside and inside. And all of us are on this path of eco ambassadors, are in this path of learning trajectories, and now they are being invited to UN summits. They will be there in this UN summit for transformative US summit for transformative education that we will be doing. I'm so glad that Peter will also be there discussing his book.
Oh, great.
We will have a lot of inspiring stories coming from this summit as well.
So I have to pause for a second because we have another guest coming in. It was just a really great opportunity and moment, thanks to Zoe Weil at the Institute for Humane Education, who we haven't even introduced yet. She has a teacher who has a brief break, I think, in the middle of the day, who's going to come in here as well. So hold on one second. And let's, Julia Fliss. So tell us, can you hear me first of all?
Yep, I can hear you. I have my mic off because of background noise. I'm actually still in my classroom. We just read from Zoe's middle school book, Claude and Medea. And so everyone's alive talking about what just happened with Medea and Claude, and is there romance and all kinds of stuff.
Interesting.
So.
Well, if you have a few minutes, Julia?
Yeah, I have about 7 minutes till we all head to lunch.
Okay.
And my kids know what I'm doing right now, so we're good.
That's amazing. Let me, Zoe, could you introduce Julia very briefly so that we can get Julia's input before she has to go? And Zoe, just introduce yourself too, but keep it quick, and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, I'll introduce myself later, but I met Julia through Twitter a few years ago, and she's one of the most amazing teachers that I've ever met, and she teaches sixth graders. She was language arts, now she's world studies, and she's an incredible inspiration to me.
Wow. Okay, so back to you, Julia. The topic here is really about education for the Anthropocene, just being a shorthand for this sustainability challenge we face, in a world with many different challenges all wrapped together. And one theme that's key in Peter Sutoris's book, is the activism part, like where students partially take charge. Like so many of us are impatient and want to get to having an impact. And so just speak briefly from the standpoint of a teacher, and remind us what grade level you're at. I think you said 5th. And how do you try to incorporate this into your work?
That's a beautiful ask. So that's exactly why I have that hashtag Solutionary G right under my name. I believe in public education, and because I believe in public education, believe that this classroom that we are in right now doesn't belong to just me. It's all of our classroom, and we get to use it to look out into the world as our bigger classroom. Because we co-create an experience of a learning journey in this room where everyone has something to give, and everyone has something to share, and everyone has something to learn from. Our learning goes to the next level. Each kiddo then becomes his or her own activist based on what they're passionate about. We bring in the Sustainable Development Goals. I think I just heard about those. We share what we see in our community that might be an issue or a problem or something we'd love to make better. Right now, we're working on food waste at our school. We're in a pretty privileged area of Colorado, Evergreen. We're 6th graders, so we're just coming into taking our kind of elementary school lenses off and putting some solutionary lenses on, so that we can look around and see the world that we live in and how we might want to make a difference to change it, improve it, and grow with it. My kiddos are definitely all about, I'm seeing more alpha generation traits of them. So there's a lot of social intelligence, social collaboration that they thrive in. And so to come all the way back around to your initial question, these kiddos want to own their learning. They want to be part of their learning journey. And because they have been in a system that has not necessarily supported them in that journey yet, when they get to this classroom and they start learning about the things that are going on in the world, and they recognize that they can choose their own adventure, put some new lenses on, and learn about what they want to learn in the world so they can make themselves and make the world what they want it to be, it's loud. It is like, oh my gosh, who knew about this before? Or can I use that map? How did you get that? Or what else is going on over here? And it just becomes this interactive experience of learning that I think is what we need to create in classrooms everywhere, not just in the United States, but in the world. We need kids to own their education so that they can pull their own seat up to the table and say, this is what I care about. This is what I want. This system of education is not sustainable the way that we are currently running it. And I want to help make a difference.
That's such a great statement of purpose. And, the other thing we can do now is all those classrooms around the world can be linked. Students in different regions with facing similar problems can talk to each other globally because of all this connectivity, or they could get data from around the world. Kids in drought zones, kids facing heat waves, someone in Pakistan can talk to someone in Arizona and, pass knowledge around. So, Peter, I didn't know if you had before Julia has to dive back into the teaching part, did you have a question that you might want to offer to her or any of the others, if you have time? But Peter.
Sure. I mean, I guess maybe just very practically, I mean, if you could give one piece of advice, to a teacher who's trying to do what you're doing, what would you advise them to do?
Connect. Just believe in the power of education. Connect with the kids, connect with the deeper learning, connect with other educators in the world who are stepping up to take the blinders off, to step outside the box, to invite in the world of humane education and humane-based pedagogy. We get to experience the world as our classroom. We get to teach kids what sustainability means and how to be healthy in systems that are not healthy. We get to be stewards of our own education. So just the deeper connection of education and educare, and like bringing out that passion and bringing out who our best selves are every day.
That's great. Connect, converse, share, and sharing. I assume the challenges as well as the wins. The lessons learned. Well, we should let you get back to the most important thing of all, which is the teaching and facilitating learning and outcomes.
Awesome.
So thanks, Julia
Thank you.
Fliss, from coming on from Evergreen, Colorado. Maybe we'll have you on again sometime.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'll watch the rest as soon as I can. Thank you for all being here and making room
Super.
for me. I didn't even get to meet everyone, but I will listen and I love to learn. So it's
And we'll
coming.
share this with you
Thank you, Zoe.
afterward.
Okay.
Wow, that was just great. So Zoe, I have to go to you now because we were talking about solutionary learning and the like there. So tell us a little bit about what that is, and then Silas, we'll get to your perspective as a doer and a student.
Well, first, thank you, Andy. It is so great to meet all of you. I can't wait to read your book, Peter. Radhika, I'm going to be following up with you. I'm just so excited by what you're all doing. Silas, I can't wait to hear from you as well. So I'll talk about Solutionary in a second, but I want to dive back into that original question you asked, Andy. It was a really long time ago, 1987. I was looking for a summer job. I was in grad school. I found a program that offered week-long courses to middle school students that was offered at the University of Pennsylvania. And I pitched a whole bunch of courses, including one on environmental issues, one on animal issues. And these kids, and Peter, this makes me think of you and your work, these kids became activists during the course of that week. And one boy went home in the middle of the week, having learned about an issue, and he made his own homemade leaflets. This was in 1987. He did not have a computer. He hand wrote his leaflets, and he came back to class the next day. He wanted to hand them out, not to his fellow classmates. They'd already learned the issue. So he was out on a Philadelphia street corner handing out his leaflets while the rest of us were having lunch. So he was transformed immediately by learning new information. A number of kids from that first class went on to form a Philadelphia area-wide student group, and a couple of them won awards for their work. I'm still in touch with a couple of them. And one of them said, I had the opportunity to speak at an event with Jane Goodall, and I invited him to it. It was in New York City. He was an adult now. He was working on HIV/AIDS issues for the mayor of New York. And I was introducing him after Jane and I gave our respective talks to some people. And I said, this is David. He was in the first course I ever taught, first humane education course. And he interjected, that course changed my life. And it also changed my life. That was when I realized this is what we need to do. We need to transform education. Education has to matter. It has to be relevant to students' lives. Literacy, numeracy, the scientific method, critical thinking, creative thinking, all of these things need to be in service of something that matters. And so that's when I ended up becoming a humane educator, going into schools, and then eventually forming the Institute for Humane Education, where our goal morphed into this word, solutionary, into educating young people to be solutionaries. And solutionaries are people who can identify unsustainable, unjust, and inhumane systems and then transform them in ways that do the most good and the least harm for everyone, for people, for animals, and the environment. And there's this ethical component to being a solutionary. It's not the same as being a problem solver. You know, you can dam a river and solve the problem of how to dam the river, or you can blow up a mountaintop for coal removal and be a problem-solving engineer, but you're not a solutionary. So I think the last thing that I want to say about this and how I've come to believe it's so important is the education system. And Radhika, this gets back to something you said, but the education system is the root system underlying every other societal system. And if we want a sustainable and just and humane future, we really have to focus on this system. And we are not focused on changing the education system. It is so slow to change. It is so traditional in so many ways. And meanwhile, kids are becoming more and more anxious and depressed. And I'll tell a quick story about that. So about 10 years ago, so this was pre-pandemic. We often like to think things are worse now, and they are. But even 10 years ago, I was invited to speak to a group of 5th and 6th graders at a middle school in Connecticut. And I asked the students what they thought were the biggest problems in the world. And they filled up a whiteboard with the same kind of problems that adults say. One boy even said sex trafficking. And obviously climate change was up there as well, and poverty, and so many different issues. And then I asked the kids to raise their hands if they could imagine us solving the problems they listed. And of the 45 kids in that class, only 5 raised their hands so that they could even imagine us solving these problems. It was the most sobering moment in my then multi-decade career as a humane educator. And so I did a guided visualization with them where I asked them to imagine that they were very old and at the end of a long and well-lived life. And I asked them to imagine themselves sitting on a park bench and the air was clean and the waterways were clean and there hadn't been a war in decades and nobody went to bed hungry because they had no choice. And after painting this vision of the future, I asked them to imagine a child joining them on the park bench, a child who'd been learning history in school and about much darker times. And then I asked them to answer the child's questions because the child wanted to know, how did things change for the better? And I asked them to answer a final question, which was the child asking them, what role did you play in helping to bring about this better world? And so while they still had their eyes closed, I asked them to raise their hands if now they could imagine us solving the problems they listed. And this time, 40 hands went up in the air. It did not take long to restore their hope. What it took was imagining a better future was possible and that they played a role in creating it. And the last thing that I will say is that shortly after that, I was invited to speak to 5th graders in a school in Guadalajara. And I asked those kids, if they could imagine us solving the problems in the world, and every hand went up in the air. And the difference was what they were learning in school. In that 5th grade classroom, their teacher had been teaching them in age-appropriate ways about environmental issues. The kids were involved in solving them. Their school had set up composting systems and put solar panels on the roof, and they had replaced disposable water bottles. They knew that problems could be solved because they had been solving them. And this is what education needs to be.
Well, that's, again, great examples of the challenge and then some approaches to addressing it. And I'd like to get the whole panel back on the screen here. Any initial reactions? So then we're going to get to Silas. You've been very patient. You have to get to work, I assume, soon in your new job. Well, actually, let's get to Silas. We've been talking about the relationship of teachers to students and the structures of education and learning. You're the one among us who's most recently been a student. So, and who always incorporated activism into what you were doing. Give a little sense, just a quick snapshot of your journey from the Adirondacks to Palo Alto. And what do you feel about what you've been hearing? You know, do you feel like, oh, yay, finally, or nah, they don't really get it? Or so tell us a little bit of your reactions and your thoughts.
No, I think they do get it. A lot of what's been said, I think, mirrors my own experience. So thank you all for the work you're currently doing. Yeah, Andy, just to the background question. I grew up upstate New York, and I owe a lot to a science museum around me called the Wild Center, which hosted youth climate summits, which are conferences for high school students and now middle school students and elementary school students that are project-based, solutions-focused, and place-based education. So non-curricular education, to your earlier point, Andy, it's not climate literacy focused. It's not even in the classroom. It's very much ingrained in networks of teachers and leadership development, really most of all. But it was, learning about the climate impacts in your local area was the model. And then at the end of these conferences, you're expected to walk out with an action plan that you've sort of written using the information you learned at the conference, drafting into a plan that you're going to take over the next year or so. And they come in teams, also with like teams of 5 students and 1 teacher. So that's sort of my first exposure to climate change and first exposure to climate solutions. Because once again, these are really focused on solutions-based education. There's one lecture on like Climate Science 101, but those conferences that we run are really focused on really leadership development and leadership competency more than anything else. And so to me, hearing all these comments, the education I received, the climate education I received really always was, I guess, I'm surprised to hear the word activism applied to myself, but I guess if like a empowered and competent student is an activist, then so be it. What comes out of these summits often in projects are students going to their school boards or their town boards or those in power with a very collaborative mindset. Like they go in feeling very credible. They usually walk out feeling quite capable, not just angry, which I think is also important. And so that's always been my experience. And so hearing sort of those characteristics of education applauded by each of you in the work that you've done, or noticed by each of you in the work that you've done, makes you smile, because that was my experience as well. Was growing up doing projects, planning projects with my peers. And again, focused on solutions. And then going into college, I started running these myself. So I created a Columbia Youth Climate Summit for New York City public school students. And again, I think it's an important distinction between what climate literacy is and what, like, I guess, as we're saying, education or the Anthropocene is, because they're not divergent, but there's so much more in the latter category as far as leadership development and exposure to what we really train students to do is think about their own interests and their own skill set and applying that to the climate question, not the other way around. It's very much not a science conference. Saying this as an engineer who went through these conferences and ran these conferences and worked with this organization, it's not a science conference. It's just leadership skills and project planning. And and so I did find myself in front of my own little small town board telling them to think about doing an energy audit and things like that, because I felt like I was credible enough to help them with that. And it is often we find students requesting collaborations as one point I'll make as a result of many of their experiences. So I know there's activism that is in the streets and protesting, but I think we have a version of activists coming out of, I mean, if you count myself as one, we're looking for collaboration with decision makers and things like that. And so that was my climate education, was very much not in the classroom. And so hearing everything again that everyone's been saying, I think does align with my own experience, and aligns with what I tried to bring to students in New York with some of the conferences I ran at Columbia.
Well, I just want to offer one reflection briefly, which is, I think it was on my 30th year writing about global warming, which started in 1988. I did a piece for National Geographic summarizing some of the things I was thinking about. And one of them was that the complexity and enormity of the climate challenge, which is so many things wrapped together. It's energy transitions, it's energy access, it's climate imbalance, climate vulnerability, which is now called climate injustice. It's innovation, it's everything. I realized, and I wrote that the really horrible thing about the climate challenge and the Anthropocene is it's so complex and intertwined and multifaceted, but it's also the good thing, because that's every student, everyone in society can take on the facet that's the best fit for your interests and your passions, the thing that wakes you up or keeps you up. You can apply it to one of those facets. And if you have 8 billion people empowered to do that and to be at least thinking about it, then that's presents a really positive possibility for the future, not a woe is me possibility. Peter, I wanted to circle back to you and your book and get you some reflections from you just on what you've heard so far and how it fits or challenges your thesis. And you know, one of the issues we have in the United States is education is all locally controlled, locally funded. Many parts of this country are now hyper attuned to messaging, getting into classrooms, to class students being active about anything. I don't know if that's true elsewhere, but so what comes to mind now? What's the next steps that would propel the message of your book forward?
Oh, that's the $1 million question. But maybe just picking up on what you just said, Andy, about this moment being so heavy and so messy, and that not necessarily being just a bad thing, right? Like there being some kind of a silver lining in that. I mean, it makes me think of where I come from. I mean, you can tell by my accent that I'm not from the US. I'm speaking to you from London today, but I was born and grew up in what was then Czechoslovakia. And I remember, my parents' generation was basically, fighting against totalitarianism. And when that regime ended in the 90s, there was a definite sense, that there is nothing to fight for, nothing to fight against. And I just remember thinking, are you kidding? I mean, there's so much, right? There's so much happening. And so I think, actually having something, to feel strongly about is important. It helps us galvanize action. So I think if we can really grasp what is at stake in this moment, then I think, that is a great opportunity, to really have, different kinds of conversations. But I guess, more broadly reflecting on what I've heard and, this whole idea of kind of what, where do we go from here? What do we do? I'm sort of a little bit ambivalent, about what the next steps are, because on the one hand, you could interpret my book as a call for bridging education with activism. But when we look at history and how good we tend to be as humans, in bringing these more radical ideas into the mainstream, our track record actually isn't that great. Even thinking about something like Sustainable Development Goals, I come out quite critical of SDGs in the book, in the sense that the word sustainability and the way that it gets used in a lot of places doesn't seem to recognize that there is a tension, between the sustainability of an extractivism, infinite growth driven economic system and sustainability of the planet, of the environment. And yet I find that in many conversations, that tension gets sort of papered over and not really recognized. So I think in a similar way, you could argue that trying to design a government-run state education system, schooling system that is built on activist principles, may not work. You might end up with very sort of diluted version of those activist principles if you try to mainstream them. And so one of the things I say in the book is that maybe what we need to recognize is that education and schooling are not one and the same thing, and that actually there's a whole lot of education that happens outside of schools. There is, a different way to think about education, not simply as a classroom, where kids come together, but, as a form of dialogue, as a form of learning, intergenerational dialogue. And if you think about it in those terms, those kind of more holistic, open terms, then maybe one of the conclusions, that we could reach is actually that in some ways, what the schools need to do is maybe get out of the way a little bit, right? They need to create space for, for activism, but not just activism. I mean, different spaces where these conversations happen organically, to sort of take root. And maybe as a society, we also need to recognize those alternative spaces, give them more support, give them more visibility, give them more funding. And so I think kind of putting the burden just on schools and on these formal education systems could backfire. I mean, at the end of the day, these are run by governments who themselves, as we know, are not doing nearly enough to really tackle the issue. So I think, what incentive do these governments have to really get young people to critique, their own lack of action? So I think that is something to perhaps reflect on and think about as we think about next steps. That yes, there is something that we can do in the education system, but maybe there are things we need to do outside of the education system as well.
Yeah, that point is comes up all the time. Peter, your video is frozen unless it's on my end, but your voice was. I could hear you fine.
Let me just see if I can.
Not quite sure what happened there because the audio is fine.
Yeah.
Anyway, but you left us with lots to talk about, and there are a couple of good questions coming in. So maybe we'll just do a quick round of on this visualization challenge. And Peter, one thing you might do is pop out completely and come back in, see if that changes things. But
okay, I'll try that.
We can hear you anyway, so it's fine. So the question, the next question is, from each of your standpoints, what would success look like a few years from, let's say 10 years from now, because it does take some time. And Peter will come back in a second. Let's start with Radhika. Peter mentioned sustainability. SDGs are kind of like they're within the structures that we know. Is there a way you grapple with that question?
I think he's right that we can't take SDGs just because they are these global goals. Environmental education is very local. So I think there needs to be a connection between global goals and what you can do locally, because sometimes those SDGs can be very disempowering that they are there, but what you can't do much because you can't influence everything that's globally done, goes to what Zoe just mentioned earlier on. So I think there needs to be some local connection to what the SDGs are. But I just wanted to go back to your question on what we should do. I think we need to look at why did these students come on the streets and now they are angry and they are striking. When you are a kindergartner or maybe a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, if you've noticed, you walk with them and they'll stop at a leaf and keep looking at it, and you are like in a hurry, come on, you have to go to school. And then they are still looking at the leaf and you are frustrated, what's wrong with them? And then you go ahead and then they are looking at some tree or hugging a tree. That just goes away. That nature loving person comes down to the streets to become an activist and saying that I don't want to go to school on Fridays because I have to strike. What has the school system done to us? So I think, the point is here that we have to go back to what Julia was saying, and then what Zoe is focusing on, humane education. Bring in the social emotional part. This feeling of loving nature has to continue. That feeling just goes away somewhere in the middle because you are focused too much on cognitive assessments and making sure that you have a lot of knowledge about environment and science. I think that needs to translate into action. And what will translate into action is if you feel for it. If you don't have any connection, you can provide any solution, make any plans. It's not going to work. It will be one more thing on the agenda or full plate that you have. So I think the solution to me is feeling for nature, connecting back to nature, and then trying to see what we can do with all the solutions that keep coming up in a more deliberative, more dialogue way, and it needs to go local.
And feeling for community. I loved what Peter was talking about, and in the book, the sections on the kids, where their films went was to people who had a connection to solutions, and that was so interesting. The more we can liberate the learning in that way, the better, I think. And Silas, what I loved about what Silas's career has been like through his educational process was not just spreading knowledge, but spreading capacity. He was, for college students to be helping high school students to organize summits is different than here's climate change, here's this. It's passing along some insights about the skill sets and the process, and that idea of Zoe. I know what you do. Working with teachers. Wife Lisa McHaley did at the Children's Environmental Literacy Foundation. Methods for building some of these concepts into existing curricula. You're not going to change all that rigidity of the demands on teachers' lives. It has to be something that just slips right in.
Mhm.
So yeah, sorry.
No, you froze for a second there. Were you going to ask me, like, how do we do that?
Yeah, or what's let's end here with some tips and strategies. And there was a question that came in from a viewer. Let me see, but you could start answering while I pull up that question.
Okay. So, this is this is everything that we think about and that we're trying to do is like, how do we do this? And so we have a variety of approaches. So we created a free solutionary guidebook for teachers that they can download on our website, humaneeducation.org. And we've created a solutionary framework in 4 phases. And I totally agree with you, Peter, about the SDGs. And there are all these teachers teaching the SDGs. So how can we work with those teachers? And so we're working with groups of teachers who are using the SDGs and then helping them to create a framework for real systems thinking and localizing the issues. So what you were just saying, Radhika, because it has to be real for the students. And while there are plenty of students who, we've had students who go through our solutionary framework and the problem that they want to address is poverty in Africa. And we encourage them to look at poverty right next door. Same thing when you're looking at climate change issues. How can you look at climate change manifestations? And we're also focusing on helping teachers to understand the difference between typical community service and humanitarian acts and real solutionary thinking, which is comprised of critical thinking, systems thinking, strategic thinking, and creative thinking to look at the root and systemic causes of problems and then solve them at that level. Even if it's a very local problem, like what's being served in your school cafeteria, if you can change that, that can spread. And so that's how we're trying to do this, is we're trying to work with teachers. And we have a solutionary micro-credential program for teachers. And we're just trying to grow and expand this so that whole schools will adopt this in a multidisciplinary way and really transform the school and the curriculum.
That's great. By the way, does anyone have a hard stop at the turn of the hour? Because I'd be happy to go a little longer. This is an important conversation. And hopefully people are taking notes out there. And this can be shared afterwards. So anyone watching now, this gets archived immediately wherever you're watching it. You can share it, and I can pass questions along to the panelists, and we can keep this going because, again, these issues are super important. I wanted to bring up one other angle, which is a little bit United States specific, if I can. I just have to close something here. Quit that. It's so weird. Computers. Here we go. Sort of. I thought I had this set up. Let's try again. There's no producer here. It's just me. So I've been tweeting and thinking a lot about shifting, as we've been saying, from thinking about the success in education as getting more people literate about climate change, something I've been trying to do for decades, to what are the things you want to get done in the world that could give us a better relationship with the climate system and with energy. And one of those is energy, sort of energy literacy, energy activism. What are we not doing? I was so struck several months ago, the Biden administration had a big program they were rolling out on energy, and they didn't, the Secretary of Energy wasn't involved. I mean, the Secretary of Education wasn't part of the rollout. And anyone who knows about a massive transition to a clean energy economy knows we don't have nearly enough electricians and technicians and trained HVAC workers, heating, cooling workers, to do the work. And this isn't about college. It's about community college. It's about job empowerment. It's about employability training. And so I've been trying to make the point that, I wish funders, lots of foundations are supporting some of these programs, could focus more on getting some of the money that we put into these arenas focused more directly on learning that's like this. I'm just going to show this one little video. I shot this in a school in the Bronx called the High School for Energy and Technology, which is essentially a vocational high school. It's a public high school. And, but I have to do the, I'm going to silence it so I could just describe what we're seeing. So these are kids. It's a specialized high school. They're learning the systems that make schools work. And on this day I was there, Otto, who is the custodian engineer for the school, he was the teacher. And these kids are learning about the fact that this school, here was Otto, a wonderful man this is a number of years ago. He was, this is a school like many in New York City that had coal was burned to keep the school hot right up until the 1990s. Coal was directly put into these furnaces. And he's talking to them about all this stuff, and they're learning in a very different way than we think of. And the school is full of solutions when you think about it. And I just think the more of that has the feel, the dimensions that I personally feel really can make a difference. But
Andy, can I jump in on that?
Sure.
I think you're so right about that. And so one of the things that has been exciting that we've seen happen. So San Mateo County in California, which Silas is right south of you, they have adopted our solutionary framework as the philosophy and approach for the entire county. It serves 113,000 students. And one of the places it's really taking root is with CTE, career and technical education. And so they are integrating this solutionary approach into just what you're talking about. So, this doesn't have to be just, future politicians and business people. This is everybody engaged in how do we create these solutions that are sustainable for the future.
So great. That's a good focus for another webcast.
Yeah.
Silas, tell us a little bit about EPRI and what you're doing there, and your cohort, and how that relates to what we're thinking here. Energy, employability, futures.
Well, we have released a report on what you just said about the degree to which the energy workforce is going to age out. So I can plug that.
Right.
I'll find the link for it. It was part of a larger supply chain report where we sort of realized, people are talking a lot about materials, but even if you have the materials, you might not have the people. The average median age of an electrician in the southeastern United States was I think above 50 or something.
Wow.
So generally, we're a research institute that does research on energy questions. I don't know how much I need to go into too much of what we do for this conversation, but something I was going to say with the comments that have been said about future of education, or what we're focusing on doing in the classroom or outside of the classroom is something we always heard from students, and I always said myself, is that students want to know that they're capable as they are right now. I think there's a lot of this connotation around schooling, and to Peter's earlier point, schooling as preparation, or like, you're waiting to fill someone else's spot. And just getting rid of that messaging, I think, is like step one, because I think it does sort of lock students out, thinking that, oh, I'm just here to prepare, like I won't be actually doing anything until 10 years from now. Whatever sort of like experiential or project learning can happen, I think, is what activates a lot of kids, and was the case for me. Before I really had my engineering education, it was still felt like I was capable, and I was to a certain extent. I was actually doing things. And so I just want to go back to that earlier point, I think, to both what Zoe and Peter have said about, letting students feel like they're capable as they are right now, in the classroom, possibly, or outside of it, thinking about their classroom like a laboratory, or their school. Like I did boiler chores too, and it was great. I had a great time. I mean, maybe it's what put me towards technical studies, but so I would say that those experiences and making that a little bit more approachable is absolutely step one.
The cool thing about a boiler room tour is you can do it virtually anywhere. Every school has some kind of system. And if you're in India in a school that doesn't have walls and is underneath a highway overpass, and that's where some learning is happening, becoming more cognizant of what needs to change builds a society that can make the change. There was this question that came in from Jenna Ball, who talks about place-based learning, outside schools as being a key opportunity, but she does say, how feasible is this? This gets at the same question Peter's book is about, and you're all aching to confront, which is how much of this is system change, how much of it's slipping in opportunities around the system. So any reactions to what she says here about place-based learning?
Yeah, maybe Andy, I can jump in here. Place-based learning and education systems. I think we have to think of education system as how UNESCO also describes it. It's like this whole continuum of informal, formal, also non-formal schools. And we always think of it as education when it comes to its schooling. It is not. It is when we should learn from our pandemic experience, where students were, or children were at home, and parents became their primary teachers, or their family relatives became their primary teachers. There were also these museums, also their libraries. Our community libraries became a place where people could access information. So I think we really need to broaden our perspective here in terms of how students are learning, and get away from this concept that they are learning only from schools. We know that there is all sorts of non-linear learning that is happening. They are learning online, they are learning from their peers. I think their peers are influencing them a lot. So to go back to Silas's model of teaching the youngsters and taking them to all these different places to make them learn, has a different kind of dynamic. So I think this whole idea of school based learning, I think it's clear that even with the pandemic, it was not just the schools that were supporting the education system. We just now need to really think about how all these different elements could have, or we can empower these places. I think the kids are already empowered to learn. If they are on a learning trajectory, they are there. How can all these different spaces become learning opportunities, and how can we connect with each other? I want to just give an example from India, where local non-profits in Bhopal, which my sister is running, uses plastic to make upcycled products with plastic. So I think there should be like a internship or student visits visiting the NGOs, where they can tell us, where the experts who are already there can tell us how these upcycled plastic products are created. And that could be another level of thinking, and could lead to another level of education for students.
That's great. I'm glad you mentioned your sister, who was on this show in the early weeks of the pandemic, in showing the kind of adaptive capacity we all need by turning what had been a plastics campaign into a network for distributing food to the poor communities within Bhopal, where they were actually facing starvation because they were locked down and couldn't do their tiny jobs for cash economy. Pooja, also a filmmaker, I mean, her work is just great. So the more of that, stimulating that capacity, finding ways to get it and then I think it just goes and runs itself to a certain extent, which I think Silas is a good example of. Peter.
Yeah, and I just wanted to maybe build on that a little bit. I think to me that question, from Jenna and what Radhika was just saying, also links to emotions. I think we tend to think of education as a kind of purely cognitive process that only engages sort of our thinking intellectual side. We don't really tend to think of education as a process for sort of understanding, making sense of our emotions. And it makes me think of these activists with whom I worked in South Africa, which was in South Durban. And Durban is the third biggest city in South Africa after Johannesburg and Cape Town. And some historians actually argue that apartheid could be sort of traced back to South Durban, because South Durban has the largest port in all of Africa. There's lots of shipping that passes through there. And that's been the case for quite a long time. And as a result, you end up with lots and lots of industries that have been built around the port. By some estimates, about 10% of South Africa's GDP originates there, including 2 massive oil refineries and about 150 other petrochemical industries. So this is a place, where you had tremendous industrial pollution, and white people would not be willing to live here and work in these factories. So you ended up with this kind of segregation. But what the activists are doing today, and the way they're sort of working with that history, is toxic tourism. So they actually take visitors like myself and others on these toxic tours of South Durban, where they take you to these viewpoints from which you can see these smokestacks, and they talk to you about environmental racism. They talk to you about more than a century of people of color being disproportionately affected by this, essentially being fodder for these industries. And when you're there, you're not just hearing the story, you are breathing the air. And that triggers a particular emotional response. We know from research in psychology that people who choose to become vegetarian or vegan don't necessarily do that because they read an article somewhere. They might do it if they go on a tour of a meat processing factory. So there is that very sort of visceral experience that triggers something in us. And then if we make sense of that emotion, that can be very transformative. And I find that we don't really pay nearly enough attention to that. So I think place-based learning, working with emotion, is a very crucial component of what I would call education for the Anthropocene. Something that we just don't really think about very much.
Zoe, I'd love to hear your reaction to that, given your focus on animal welfare as a big component of the Anthropocene challenge.
And I totally agree with Peter on this. And in fact, have taken students to see factory farms, tried to take them to see a slaughterhouse, but was told the students wouldn't understand, so I couldn't bring them. But there are other ways. If we can't actually go to certain places, we can see videos of them. We can talk to people, we can have guest speakers come and talk about their experiences. So it's a both and. And I wondered with Jenna's question if PBL was referring to place-based, because it could also be referring to project-based.
Project-based, you're right.
And I wanted to respond to Jenna, the first part of Jenna's question, which is, do you think it's feasible that we can change the education system? And I think it's really hard. And I've been dedicated to doing that for a really long time. And at the same time, right now, it's even harder because the pandemic has left so many teachers so overwhelmed. And in the United States, the political backlash on teaching about certain issues has left teachers and administrators really feeling afraid to teach about essential issues of our time. And so in some way, and we know teachers are leaving the profession as well. So in some ways, this is a really, really hard time to change the system of education. And in other ways, it's an incredible opportunity. And not to keep plugging the solutionary approach, but the approach by design is meant to be an antidote to polarization and to the sort of debate focus that we have, which we have in schools. You know, kids are often required to participate in debates, and somebody may assign them one side or the other of an arbitrary and fabricated topic, and they have to research their side and argue it to try and win, as opposed to looking at the underlying problem or problems and identifying those problems that the group can agree are legitimate problems, and then working together collaboratively to solve them. And that means talking to the variety of stakeholders. And by doing that approach, we kind of we ease that sense of constant conflict by getting to the deeper causes that everybody can agree on. You know, nobody is sitting there thinking like, I want to live on a polluted planet. I really want the temperature to increase so much and lose half of all species on Earth by the end of the century. Like, people don't want that. So I think this is a both and in terms of what happens in schools, what happens out of schools. But I don't want to give up on the educational system, because millions and millions and millions of children are in that system every single day of the week, except the weekends.
This is true. Well, this has been a fantastic. I think this is the first of what could be a track. We could even all reconvene. If you could each think of someone else to come in. It was great having Julia, the teacher, in from the classroom. The connectivity point that she made to me, I did a show early in the pandemic with Dan Hammer, who runs something called earthrise.education. It's not .edu, it's .education, which connects students anywhere with data that can help them identify areas in the Amazon rainforest that are being deforested illegally. And there were students in Iowa and in Massachusetts who, during lockdown, were using their computers to help generate what became a story in Reuters, a news article about illegal mining going into Indian reserves. And so the connectivity part is really super. It's connecting us here right now. Peter, your book stimulated this show. Good luck with it going forward. I think we could easily come back, depending on your schedule. There's more to talk about for sure. And so I just want to thank each of you for being here today. What is education for in the Anthropocene? We certainly got going on that question, and there's more to say. Silas, again, it's great to have you on. I've been trying off and on for years to get you on here. Let me know how things are going at EPRI. We could do something. I'm doing more on that issue of the workforce for energy transition. So spread the word there. I'd like to do a show on that work that's happening. And that's it for now. This is Andy Revkin, Columbia Climate School Sustain What webcast, one of many on a key question: is education for impact in these tumultuous but promising times, with a wonderful array of guests here: Peter Sutoris, Radhika Iyengar, Silas Swanson, and my neighbor Zoe Weil. So everybody out there, it's shareable right away, wherever you're watching: Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and the rest. And send me your questions. That little scrolling bar at the bottom tells you how to get in touch with ideas and questions to go forward. And let's navigate this week and do our best to navigate this century in ways that have the fewest regrets and the most wonderful ahas. Take care. Stay well. And we are ending the show.